All right, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. All right. And just to make sure I don't have this same slide issue, do you all see a slide that says overview right now? Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. Sorry I could not be there in person with you guys. Some family situations, which I'm sure you guys will appreciate as a family organization, but definitely miss all our friends and families. Thank you very much for allowing me to do this virtually. I'm just going to review the very basics of prion disease. If you attend any of the scientific talks, a lot of it's going to be pretty high level. But if you take away some of this, you might be able to understand some of it, and hopefully I can help you put it in a clinical context as well. So a brief overview of what I'll talk about today. First, we'll describe what we mean by the term prion, and we'll review some of the demographic features of prion disease in humans. And then we'll review the diagnostic process for prion disease. So first off, what is a prion? It's the thing that underlies all prion diseases. We all make normal prion proteins. That's the structure on the left. In our field, we call that PRPC. And it's supposed to be there. We all make that. It's mainly expressed in our brain and in our gut. And it has a variety of housekeeping functions, such as brain cell repair and binds to other metals and whatnot in our body. We don't entirely know everything it does, but it does have a role that's normal and healthy. The problem with prion disease is when that normal prion protein changes its 3D shape. So it's actually the same exact protein. It's the same amino acids, the same sequence. It's just a different shape. And that's the structure on the right. In our field, we call that PRPSC, which stands for scrapie prion protein. And scrapie was a prion disease of sheep and goat. So that's why it got its name. So some people refer to this as PRPSC, prions, but this is the disease-associated form of the prion protein. And underlying the prion paradigm is, again, we have the normal prion protein, the yellow dots, and then either it spontaneously misfolds, something that we call sporadic prion disease, or it can come into contact with an infectious form. And the infectious form, the blue dots, will convert the yellow dots into itself. And you get more and more of the abnormal prion protein in this kind of exponential curve that is underlying the propagation or the progression of prion disease within a person's brain. And unfortunately, in addition to its ability to move throughout different areas of the brain using this mechanism, it's also detrimental to brain cells and causes them to die. The vast majority of prion diseases occur in that sporadic fashion. That's 85%. Again, we think it's just a spontaneous change in the normal prion protein, just changes its shape. And we have a couple of named sporadic prion diseases. To be honest, these specific names aren't so important as long as we just know that they're all sporadic. But by far the most common prion disease is something that we refer to as sporadic CJD. There's another prion disease called variably protease-sensitive prionopathy, and a third one called sporadic fatal insomnia. They have different names simply because they look different clinically and they look different underneath a microscope. But they're all the same thing. They're all sporadic prion disease. They just look different. 10 to 15% are due to a genetic mutation of the prion protein gene that makes that normal prion protein in all of us. The thought is that when you have a mutation in that gene, you make a slightly altered version of the normal prion protein that makes it more likely to misfold during your lifetime. Like sporadic prion disease, there are a couple named genetic prion diseases. The most common, of course, is genetic CJD. but also there's illnesses like Gershman-Straussler-Schenker disease and fatal familial insomnia. Again, they're all due to a genetic mutation of the prion protein. They just differ in what they look like clinically underneath the microscope, and also they usually have different mutations or different sections of the prion protein gene that have differences in it that will result in those different looks of the prion disease. And then thankfully, under 1% of all prion diseases are the acquired forms, sometimes referred to as the infectious causes. And that includes things like Kuru, which was a prion disease that was transmitted through ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea, iatrogenic or medically transmitted CJD, usually through the reuse of brain matter from a cadaver who had passed of CJD and reused in a healthy individual, or sometimes instruments used for neurosurgery that was used in someone who had prion disease that was then used in a healthy person. And then finally, variant CJD, which is what we call prion disease in a human due to eating meat contaminated with bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also sometimes referred to as mad cow disease. The kind of number that everyone throws around for how frequent the illness is 1 in a million. That's not entirely inaccurate or accurate. It's something that we refer to as an incidence. In public health, we refer to the incidence as the number of new cases that happen every year across the entire population due to a specific disease. And that number is about 1 to 2 per million per year. So the harder the look, the closer you get to 2 per million per year. But not all people get prion disease. It tends to be a disease of mid to late life. So you don't see a lot of younger people. So if we were going to break out the incidence by age, you'll see that everyone combined is about 1 to 2 per million per year. But if you look at the older population, the population that's much more likely to get prion disease, that incidence is closer to 4 to 7 per million per year. And on the other hand, if you look at younger people, where it's not super common to get prion disease, that's under 1 per million per year. So I think that not a whole lot of people think in public health statistics. Most of us think about how common an illness is or how common something is by how frequent it occurs. So another way of doing that is look at how many deaths happen every year due to prion disease. And in the US, it's about 1 in every 6,000 deaths every year due to prion disease. That also equates to a lifetime incidence. So that means that everyone has a 1 in 6,000 chance of developing prion disease. So again, you may have heard that 1 in a million number kind of referred to in that way. It's different. It's 1 in a million per year for the entire population, whereas the 1 in 6,000 is your overall lifetime risk. So hopefully that helps clear things up. Again, it's still a rare disease, but when it's talked about using that incidence number, I think people maybe assume it's rarer than what it actually is. One of the unfortunate things about prion disease that you all know too well is how quick it is. So this was a study that Ionis helped us with that looked at public databases for medical visits in the US. So it's kind of a general population study. And we looked at how much time passed before the first symptom of prion disease till someone died. And that was about 6 months. So that's about the average that's reported, 4 to 6 months. But I like to call attention to this very last part where the median time from the first time that someone diagnosed the patient with prion disease until someone passed was only about a month. So that means that people are only living about a month from the time that they get diagnosed to the time that they pass. Of course, there's a lot of variation in this, and of course, this is one way to look at this. Again, if we look at the very last one on the right, you see that 67% of people die within 2 months of being diagnosed. There's obviously a lot of variation in that. You see people that live even over a year after they are diagnosed with the disease, but most people do pass quite quickly after the diagnosis. But also just quickly after the onset of the disease.
Mas depois do início da doença também, nós estamos aqui olhando o quê? Estamos falando aqui de 6 meses, mais ou menos, em média. Quais são os sintomas típicos da doença priônica? E agora nós vamos examinar o motivo pelo qual esse gráfico é do jeito que é. Porque leva-se tanto tempo para diagnosticar alguém com a doença priônica, porque estamos considerando aqui em torno de um intervalo de 5 meses, a partir do momento que a pessoa tem os sintomas e até o momento em que ela recebe o diagnóstico correto. Então, claro que na medicina você reconhece os sintomas, é por isso que você vai ao médico, né? É por isso que o médico faz um check-up e tenta ver o que é que está de anormal com você. Mas um dos problemas é que existem muitos sintomas da doença priônica. Pode ter comprometimento cognitivo, problemas de raciocínio, problemas de marcha, e há uma variedade também de movimentos anormais que as pessoas podem ter, como tremores, não é, espasmos musculares, ter, por exemplo, transtornos visuais, pessoas que podem ter alucinações ou problemas de percepção e até visão dupla, podem desenvolver também uma variedade de fraqueza muscular e coisas assim, se a doença estiver localizada em outras partes do corpo. E algumas pessoas também têm sintomas mentais ou psiquiátricos que podem ir desde depressão, passando por ansiedade, alterações comportamentais e coisas assim. Então, há uma ampla gama de sintomas aí para só uma doença causa. Isso faz parte do problema. Agora, quando nós diagnosticamos a doença priônica, nós temos um conjunto de sintomas que são sugestivos em relação à doença. Não é? Há um trio comum. E qual é o trio que vem?
This patient has X, Y, and Z. They would at least think of CJD, and that is problems with someone's thinking, problems with someone's balance, and then something called myoclonus, which is a muscle jerking movement. So those are kind of the classic symptoms that you would see with prion disease. And I think a lot of people would be diagnosed fairly quickly if they presented with those symptoms. However, the problem is, as with other progressive brain illnesses, people don't present with all 3 symptoms simultaneously. It takes time for those symptoms to evolve. So if you look at the initial clinical symptoms of patients with sporadic CJD, the plurality just have isolated symptoms in their thinking. So if you go to a doctor with that, they may think of much more common causes of those symptoms like dementia, Alzheimer's disease, maybe depression, but you're certainly not going to think about CJD. 17% will have just visual changes, and sometimes these cases are extremely quick. And because of that and some of the MRI changes, they're often misdiagnosed as having a stroke. Most people don't think of prion disease because most people with prion disease don't just have visual symptoms alone. Only about 13% of people will present with that kind of classic 3-symptom presentation of memory problems, balance problems, and myoclonus. So the key here is it takes time for people to develop all the symptoms that might be suggestive to a doctor that this could be prion disease. So if you think about medicine, it's really no different than going to see a car mechanic. My dad was a car mechanic, and he used to always make fun of me because he said that we had it easy. We only had 2 models to work with, male and female, whereas auto mechanics had to deal with Ford, Volvo, Chevy. You get the point. But it's a very similar process, and that is you look for a collection of signs and symptoms that help point to what the underlying problem might be. In medicine, we call this a syndrome. So, for example, those classic 3 symptoms that I mentioned before would be the syndrome that would be suggestive of prion disease. And recognizing those syndromes allows the clinician or your doctor to go down a list of possible causes. And when they have that list of possible causes, then they know what tests to order. They start ordering them and they see what the results are. So if we take the example of maybe a computer IT tech person and the computer doesn't work, they're going to go through a variety of processes to figure out what's going on. So first, they're going to make sure the monitor is plugged in and that it's working properly. You might take the monitor and plug it into another computer to see if it works. You want to make sure that the keyboard and the mouse are connected. Again, you might try that on another computer to see if it works. And then even if that fails, then you're going to start looking at the computer itself, the hard drive. Or maybe there's a software problem. But there's a kind of a hierarchy of things that you're going to go down and check off to try to problem solve what's going on. Medicine is no different from that. It's all about problem solving in as much of a standardized fashion as one can do. So we're going to end with just going through a scenario of a hypothetical patient who has prion disease that goes to their physician and gets an evaluation. And I'm hopeful that this will help illustrate why it takes so long for people to get a diagnosis. So this individual shows up to their physician and they have some memory problems. So the doctor asks them questions about their memory problems. They do an exam. And then again, depending on the syndrome or the collection of symptoms that the doctor is able to get from the patient, they have a list of possible diagnoses that they have to consider. That could be Alzheimer's disease, vitamin deficiencies, thyroid problems, depression. But they're going to take that list and then they're going to order tests that could be helpful to figure out which of those conditions is actually going on in that patient. And that could be paper and pencil testing to look at someone's thinking in more detail. It could be blood tests to look for vitamin deficiencies or thyroid problems. It could also be a brain MRI to look to see if there's been things like strokes or brain tumors, things like that. So say that patient goes, they do all the workup, and then they come back a month later and they see the same doctor and they say, "Doc, now not only do I have memory problems, my balance is very bad. I'm falling. Sometimes when I get up, I just spontaneously fall over." And that's important information for the doctor because now the list of possible causes is going to be different because now you have symptoms that are reminiscent of a different part of the brain. So now we have to include on that list of possible diagnoses that includes both parts of the brain that causes those two separate symptoms. So now you can add things like blood vessel disease, infections, inflammation of the brain, and of course CJD is about this time should probably be added at this point. And you're probably going to do additional tests. You might do blood tests that weren't done before because certain conditions weren't considered before. You might do another type of brain image, or might go back and look at the image that was already done, looking at it in the context that you now know that the patient is experiencing different symptoms. And they may undergo other tests like a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap, because sometimes the only way to look for what's going on in a patient is by looking at the spinal fluid itself. You can't find that in the blood, unfortunately. And the most important thing here is you want to go down that list and see if you can rule out potential causes and then look for tests that may suggest that this is what's going on, X, Y, or Z. So when we look specifically at prion tests, there are kind of three big ones. There's called the electroencephalogram, or EEG, that looks at brain waves. There's the brain MRI, and then there's the spinal tap. So the EEG used to be the only test that we had. Nowadays, we have much better tests. So right now, it's mainly helpful for ruling out other causes like really bad seizure disorders. However, in some settings, you can see a pattern that's quite suggestive of prion disease. However, you're not going to see that in every case, and you only usually see it at one part of the illness duration of the disease. The brain MRI, fortunately, will be suggestive of prion disease in most cases, about 95% of cases if you know what you're looking for. It drastically narrows down the possibilities. You can see that there's no strokes, there's no tumors. And again, if you see this MRI here, where you see the brightness in the outside part of the brain and the middle part of the brain, that really narrows down the possibilities of what could be going on to really about 2 or 3 illnesses. And what's important is if you remember our hypothetical patient in the beginning, she had a brain MRI as part of her initial workup, even though prion disease was not suspected due to her symptoms. So it's possible that in the process of her getting her brain MRI, it could have come back looking like this, suggestive of prion disease, and that might have actually been the first thing that clued the physician off that maybe this is prion disease. So this has become an extremely helpful test, especially in cases where clinically you might not suspect the illness. And then the spinal tap, in my opinion, the spinal tap, the most important thing is still to rule out other causes, because the list of conditions that can cause prion disease, there's a fair amount of conditions on there that are treatable illnesses, sometimes completely curable. And if you don't do a spinal tap, you won't be able to see that. So the first rule of medicine is do no harm. So we want to make sure that we're capturing everything that we could possibly do for a patient. So the number one reason to do that spinal tap is to rule out treatable causes of that person's symptom that you're not going to be able to get in any other way. We do have other markers. We have 2 markers for CJD. One set of markers are suggestive of CJD. This is what Ayrton was talking about earlier. That's 1433. In the US, we use total tau as well. So these are usually elevated in prion disease, but they're also very elevated in anything else that causes a lot of badness in the brain. So 1433 is almost positive in everything that you would see on that list of possibilities that could cause prion disease. So again, it's a useful guide, but it doesn't mean that someone has prion disease at all. And then we have one marker that I think you'll hear about later today called RT-QuIC, which stands for real-time quaking-induced conversion, that's able to amplify very, very small amounts of the abnormal prion protein in the spinal fluid to a level that we can detect it. Now, this is a disease-specific marker, meaning that we would only expect to see it in prion disease. So that's helpful, because if you do a spinal tap in someone, order that test, and it comes back positive, they're almost certain to have that disease, because it's very, very rare to have that be positive in anything but prion disease. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit about how the diagnostic process goes. I'm so sorry it takes so long to diagnose the disease. I think we have done a lot better, especially with brain MRI and with RT-QuIC. But if you remember that graph that looks at the time from onset of symptoms to someone passing and the time from diagnosis to someone passing, there's always going to be that delay, because there's always going to have to be a suspicion from the clinician to order that test that would tell them whether or not it's prion disease. Again, that's a little bit helped now because of brain MRI, and someone who's not even suspected of having the disease could be positive and be suggestive, but will always be limited to some extent by that delay. So these are some of the wonderful people we work with. Last but not least, behind me is this gentleman here, Ayrton, who I think is probably a national treasure for you guys. I can only think of one other person who has worked at 3 different surveillance centers in the world. And I'm not even quite sure that she worked at 3. I know 2 for sure. So he's a really special gentleman. We're very happy to have him at the Prion Center. He's a joy to work with. And we're so happy for you guys that you have him on your side. So thank you very much. And I hope you guys really enjoy the conference. We'll miss you.